Okay, so welcome to our first series and what we're calling In Depth, which is a chance for us to engage critically with some of the pertinent topics and concepts that really animate our society and world in a way that then relates back to our Christian faith and the documents of our Christian faith and some of the underpinnings and theology thereof. This week, we're going to launch and start with capitalism, Marxism, and Christianity. And I'll tell you my thesis up front, which is essentially that I believe that philosophically we have come out of a long period back into the realm where Christianity now has some philosophical pertinence again because of the philosophical landscape as it stands currently. So we'll also start at the end and then go to the beginning. And when I say the end, I'm going to refer to a guy named Fukuyama, who was a philosopher during the Reagan era and who maybe even sat on his cabinet. And he wrote a book called The End of History.
Francis Fukuyama.
Francis, yes, exactly right. In it, he posits that the arrival and the widespread use of liberal democracies represents the end of history, that we have arrived at a final conclusion. And essentially part of his argumentation in that was that the two great remaining meta-narratives that held sway over people, capitalism and Marxism, ultimately settled their battle, and capitalism fundamentally won. And that the liberal democracy of capitalism was the victor of those two things. And his chief point was to say that the imaginations of people are now so fundamentally settled on capitalism that they cannot imagine a different future anymore. And his proof goes on to say, look at science fiction, look at your pieces of media and literature. Nobody has fundamentally identified an alternative future that doesn't move almost deeper into the underpinnings of capitalism. Fukuyama, now in this era of emergent right-wing populist and increasingly authoritarian regimes, now seems to have some of his support erode a bit, but he's still, and that premise stands as one of the very, very important markers in this long journey. It begins, however, a long time back. Really what we should begin with in any discussion of this is with the gospel. And this gospel we read this week was about the crucifixion of Jesus. On Christ the King Sunday, we only hear the end of the story, but it's really significant that a lot of the story of Jesus Christ has to do with actually economic exchange. Jesus spends a lot of time talking about economic exchange, about what happens in a person's life when they are involved in trading goods and services and when they participate in the economic life of the community, the people who are excluded from economic life within their communities. He talks about the good that comes from material, and he also situates it in a broader Christian and Judeo-Christian context that is not simply materialist. However, in the years afterwards, a lot of debate happens after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the formation of these communities. A lot of debate happens about where does materialism, where does material, broadly speaking, fit into the spectrum of what Christians believe in. And I think that one of the reasons for that is sociological and sociopolitical. The Christians were a small group of people who were oftentimes marginalized, and toleration seems to have been one of the really key things that Christians sought in that first era, because it was a method of survival. Being tolerated by the culture meant that you could get by. And it's safe to be tolerated so long as you don't make material demands upon your society. As long as you say the realm of stuff is all of you, the realm of the spirit is me, then you've crafted for yourself a niche that you can survive and thrive in. And so there was a lot of movements in Christianity, like the aesthetic movement, that really actually renounced the physical in all forms and said, we're really going to be about the things of the spirit, the things of the higher calling. So we have to fast forward a pretty long distance. That ends up being an underpinning to the critique of Christianity. And it's brought up by a lot of thinkers, and they lift that up, even whether it's a totally valid critique or not, because orthodoxy doesn't really affirm asceticism. Orthodoxy affirms a more nuanced view of spirit and flesh being united, mind and body, prayer and service, that those things have to coexist simultaneously, but nevertheless it becomes something people are happy enough to use as a critique of Christianity. Nietzsche does it. Hegel, to his part too, does as well. And he's really the next part of this story. Because Hegel, when he writes his dialectics and looks into the phenomenology of spirit, for instance, he identifies that what's most important in philosophical study is a study of history, a study of progression, that there is a movement through time that's significant. There's a story to be told, essentially. And Hegel makes part of his storytelling happen in the realm of material, in the realm of things. And he does so in a way that's, I think, really, really fascinating. And we have to look at this because this is proto-Marxist. He identifies a master and a slave dichotomy. If you're hearing Nietzsche in your heads too, you should. These thinkers all sort of play off one another. Hegel argues that there are really two sort of primordial influences that are at work in people and communities in sort of archetypal. There is a person with strength, and there's a person who is less strong. And the impulse always is that the strong person is lords it over the weaker person. But it's more complicated just than that, because what the weaker in this dichotomy needs to do is to basically give their acquiescence to the stronger force, because the stronger force needs to be perceived as such in order to even call themselves the stronger force. So it is to say that essentially there is no master without a slave, and that this is the whole reason for this recurrent motif that the two simultaneously need one another. The master is as much slave to the slave as the slave is owing its survival to the whims of the master. And when Nietzsche hears this, he says, I'd rather be the master. When Marx hears this, he says, what we need to do is liberate from whatever this oppressive force is, that this is again existing in the material world, this is existing in the world of bodies and things, and he situates it on a timeline of history that's different than probably what Hegel would have done, but says, I see what you're talking about. While there was a master in the form of a king during the rule of medievalism and in the rule of feudalism, now the next ruling power is this rule of the factory owners over the workers, that the proletariat is now identified as being the slave in this system. But the benefit, he said, of capitalism is it provides for the benefit that we all get to see this laid out and laid bare. It provides the mechanisms and the bones for people to realize their own oppression and to see it for what it is, which never would have been possible actually in the pre-modern era when people just didn't have access to the education and into those means of communication the way that they did later. So let's put a pause on Marx, because we should go back then to Adam Smith, who is a Scottish guy and really quite brilliant and is a really fascinating sort of multidisciplinary thinker who draws from all sorts of different realms of ethics and is very much also a naturalist, and so is looking at the world in a broader sense. But he too arrives at some of the same conclusions that both Hegel and Marx do, which is that fundamentally the only things that are worth analysis or that can be trusted in their analysis are literally things. You can't have metaphysical discussions and hope to come away with anything of worth, because it's just far too fuzzy. And so he says that a prolonged study into wealth actually reveals some of the answers that we have looked at, or into things itself, reveals some of the answers of things that we've looked at, starting at the other end, starting at the Platonic realm of ideas. He goes, no, start at the physical realm of things, and then work backwards to get your conclusions about anything from ethics to organization. And his conclusions are pretty striking as well. I mean, he argues for a free marketplace of competition. This is liberalism in its classical form, that people should be free to perform commerce to their abilities. And he comes up with another really interesting concept about the essential inequity that has to be accepted in the system, which is, as he says it, that certain people, groups, and nations are able to make more and better with the same resources. And that underpins his entire philosophy of, and so fundamentally that has to be accepted into the system, that there is some inequality. And that, I think, is the rub that separates out even contemporary socialism and Marxism from capitalism. Is that while Marxism always strives towards the egalitarian and strives for the equality of all people, capitalism understands that there is a baked-in inequality, and that is represented in wealth. That there are some who will gather more than others, who will have more than others, and that there are certain privileges that go along with that in the system. And you can't totally separate out any of these two ever. As Fukuyama would have easily said, we always exist, we exist in a capitalist democracy. The democracy means one vote, one person. The capitalist says different dollars for different people. So that rub is always present in our societies. Here's where things get interesting, because I'm actually done talking about Adam Smith. I'm done talking about Karl Marx. As much as this is about Marxism and capitalism, this is so much more, I think, about the world afterwards, which is where we are finding ourselves in now. In the 20th century, the explosive theology, or the explosive philosophy that came onto the scene was called structuralism, that turned into post-structuralism, that turned into postmodernism. And this was all sort of starting with this seed in structuralism. Structuralism is based on one premise. It's starts with grammar, as a matter of fact. It says that take a language. If you are learning a new language and somebody comes up to you and says, points at an oak leaf and says, Ufta. I'll do a Norwegian for you. Ufta. What does that mean? Does that mean oak leaf? Or does it mean leaf? Or does it mean tree? Or does it mean leaf that hasn't fallen yet? Or is he pointing past the leaf? Or is he pointing to the spirit of the thing? Is it the color? You don't know any of those things because you only have one reference point, one word to work with. You need another one. But even the second one doesn't always give you all the information you need. You might need a third reference point or a fourth. Actually, what you'll need is an infinite number of reference points in order to actually fully ever understand a language. And the argument in structuralism was then pushed forward into post-structuralism that says that this doesn't just hold true for grammar, this holds true for all things. You can't fully understand any person without a full contextual personhood comprehensive study. You can't do so in terms of politics or governance or anything. And eventually, postmodernism came along and said, this sounds the death toll for all of our modern meta-narratives that hope to make sense of, broadly speaking, everything in one story. There is no such thing. This is an impossible task. Context is too important, and there is no way to push oneself into that. So postmodernism takes aim, therefore, at both capitalism and Marxism, because both of them sell a story. They sell a really, really big narrative that makes sense out of everything. The other thing that does that is Christianity. Christianity sells an entire worldview, including one that involves an ethical element where you fit into the universe, God's plan with a beginning, a middle, and end. Marxism too, by the way, has a faithful element to it that sounds a lot like Christianity in this sense, where the rising up of the proletariat is still yet to come, and the collapse of capitalism is still yet to come. And capitalists, for their part, in the doubting of Marxism, make a faith for themselves too, and saying that is, simply speaking, never going to happen. Fukuyama is correct. We are in the end of history. This is the last form of organization, of capital organization. So that is what people like Derrida, who is one of the first grammatologists who look at these things, sort of comes up with. I mentioned in my sermon a guy named Jean Baudrillard, and this is a really hard. He's French. All these guys are, by the way, from a school of thought called the Continental School, and that happens to be kind of like a combination of where they are located with a separation from the analytic school of philosophy that was happening at the time. But it mostly means they're all going to have French last names. Derrida is one of the only people, by the way, who wasn't born in France. He's actually an Algerian Jewish guy, and his contribution to all this, I think, comes in large part from his outsider status and his ability to see language and what it is to stand outside a system while everyone else buys into it and believes it. But yet you know that the normative elements of whatever everyone's believing are actually also on display, right? So that is to say, everything that everyone else has bought into and accept hook, line, and sinker, he said, really, but why? And then you start to see little by little. There's. You want to say something, Gary?
Well, I'm just thinking. It sounds like the structuralists would say that Derrida hadn't fully absorbed everything in the universe that other people were seeing, either Marxists or capitalists, and therefore he wasn't able to understand.
There's an element of there is an element of a lot of postmodern thinking that almost feels like an awakening, right? These messages that we have been taught and conditioned, once you realize that they are actually the result of social conditioning, oftentimes, or of the repetition of narrative, that you hear them and hear them and hear them again until they become the only way that you're even capable of thinking about them. Waking up from them feels like waking up to a new reality, and you see them differently. You see your whole world differently. This also, by the way, plays out in other really tangible ways. There's a school of postmodern architecture, for instance. It makes a clean break from what was called Keynesian modernism, which you'll see, displayed. Chicago's a great city for this. It's where the guy was from. He made square glass buildings that went upwards, and they maybe had a lobby. And the idea was you could export that concept anywhere throughout the world. And if you did that, you couldn't tell when you walked in the building whether you're in Dubai or Chicago or in Copenhagen or whether you're in Sri Lanka. The building was the same. That was the whole point, was that modernism was a way to take the person and to mold them through narrative into a meta-narrative of capitalism. You worked in your in your cubicle, you were this person, you were shaped and molded in that way. Postmodern architecture says that while you have to accept that is now a part of our history and part of the larger context, it strives to include other things in its design elements. The way the river bends, it takes design features from close by buildings and tries to incorporate them as well. It doesn't push back entirely against the idea of social conditioning, but it brings it to the forefront so that it's obvious that there are forces at work and at play in our world, and I think then allows us the project, or at least opens up the idea that we might be captains of our own destiny and seek to put what we want into practice on buildings in our lives, in our human architecture, in our societies. So there's a liberative aspect to this. So Baudrillard, who I mentioned I should say one more thing about Derrida. Derrida is also one of the thinkers who moves this from a purely grammar-based or linguistic study into something more metaphysical and more fundamental. He says that the way that language works like that, so does memory. So all of the things that we thought before were the foundation stones that we could trust are, as he calls them, cinders. They're floating away in the wind, just little bits of glowing ember, what we thought we could trust. You can't trust the written word the way that we thought I could trust. You can't trust even your own memory of events. It's just as folly. You can't trust society to tell a truthful story. Any of those foundation stones that the Enlightenment thinkers would have built upon, whether it's reason or the divine right of kings or any of those things, all have eroded away. We're left really without a basis in the postmodern world. It's where a lot of the criticism of postmodern comes from, because that's scary to a lot of people. It leaves us without any foundation from which to build a system of ethics, in their opinion. But I will circle back to that, because I don't know that that's actually a fair comparison. Baudrillard, he says that we are now in this system, as I said, of the system of control, where the subject and the object have fundamentally flipped. If back in the day, cognito ergo sum, the subject knows that the subject is a subject because there is an object to behold. Now he says the object has won the battle of subject versus object. We tell stories about ourselves through the things we buy, how we wear ourselves. We have acquiesced to the idea of materialism so much that what really reigns in our world now is object, is stuff. No longer is a human being first and foremost expressed as a subject. They're first and foremost expressed by the symbols and the objects that adorn them, or that they live in, or that they work for.
So I have, therefore I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that should be frightening, because that shows, I don't know, it shows kind of the ultimate conclusion of materialist philosophies taken to their utmost.
If you have less, then that means you are less.
Yeah, essentially. Or if nothing else, because Fukuyama says you can't imagine a society without capitalism, if you have less, you are now defined by your less as well. Yeah. Whether you want to put a worth thing on there, I think it's valid to do that. But nevertheless, the reference point always will be the object, as opposed to the subject in itself.
And if you have less but want more, I think that things are unequal for you. Where does that take you? Because you're not, maybe you do feel you have less and think it's unfair. Maybe that's it.
A Marxist critique would be yes, that then the person asks, why do I have less?
Yeah, you say Marxist, but I guess I think that whether you're Marxist or capitalist, both of these theories, systems of thinking, think about where you are in the world of commerce.
Yeah.
I mean, or you live.
The person is situated in an economic reality.
Yeah.
That's the only thing worth talking about.
You have an old car, you have a new car, a big car, whatever.
Yep.
It's all that, and I think Marx and Adam Smith would say the same.
Mm-hmm. They would.
So I'm not sure where that takes us, but anyway.
No, I think that's you hit the nail on the head. That's the most important part of all this. And I mean, within the American context too, the famous passages, there are no rich and poor in America, right? There's only the rich and the temporarily embarrassed billionaire, right? That's the belief is teleological in the end. And the teleology, the end of things, is going to be a materialist end in both realities. Whether or not it arrives in some sort of egalitarian utopia of Marx's design, where enough is had by all, or whether it arrives in the more probably, I would say in the American conception of capitalist, the individualistic triumph of the person into whatever wealth means for them. Although I would say that there are plenty of those thinkers who, especially since the neoliberal movement has come up, said no, it can be both. There can be a social victory where everybody through the use of liberal democracy and capitalism, everybody is raised up into wonderful wealth. But that's really just almost like a micro narrative within a larger meta narrative. When I say meta narrative, I mean, like I say, something that explains an entire worldview, and that's what these thinkers are talking about when they critique the validity of any meta narrative. Likely the underpinnings of these things just simply aren't true. So, having moved through Hegel, through Smith, through Marx, through Baudrillard, through Foucault's analysis, I would say too that I talked about in my sermon of each of these systems being actually fundamentally about control. These aren't just means of explaining the world. These meta-narratives have a goal in mind, which is the ordering of society into a certain format. And who's the person who's playing king? It almost doesn't matter. It kind of matters. I mean, whether that person is elected or whether they fought their way there, they have at their fingertips these means of control. And that's what they'll use, because that's where we are now, is in the realm of materialist control. Where does that bring us with Christianity? Well, like I said, Christianity oftentimes gets a bad rap as having a spiritualist take on things that doesn't have anything to do with material. And materialism and the materialist philosophies, I think, have, unfortunately, an equally bad track record in actuality of having nothing to do with spirit. They, as a result of something that Derrida mentioned, took the individual and atomized him, and they took concepts and did the same thing. They formed these odd sort of splits where concepts have been divided into a left-hand side and a right-hand side, with some agreement on either of those two categories, but a chasm in between, so they don't have anything to do with one another. So, for instance, fact exists on one side, and value exists on the other. Reason exists in one side, emotion exists on the other. In a sort of high enlightenment version, male exists on one side, female exists on the other. Public exists on one side, private exists on the other. And between those two things, we are told that there's, like I said, there's this chasm. Fundamentally, they are opposites. They're two sides of a pole. And that has brought us to some pretty troubling places in the modern world, with a lot of people who have said, I don't know if my spirit is being attended to in a purely materialist society, or to the ordering of societies in a way that leads them to do great evil. And when they do this evil, there really isn't any nomenclature that we have left to explain why that's wrong. I always say this whenever I think about where these things lead to. With Oppenheimer, after the creation of the atomic bomb, a scientist, a man, reasonable, everything on that side finally says, today the physicists have known sin, a term that belongs on the other side of that chasm. But his fundamental point is that if our high enlightenment values lead us to the development of the nuclear weapon, a existential threat, then we need to collapse those two categories back into one again, and see that they're false dichotomies. Christianity survived through these materialist times sidelined to a certain extent. In the early stages of the High Enlightenment, it was such a bastion and was always considered such an important part of Western society that it really more or less survived unscathed. And many of the thinkers of the High Enlightenment, even when they write their works, Hegel, Kant included, they reference God as the point of their philosophy, an exploration of the laws of God and nature. Really, it's only when we start to get into Nietzsche, and by the time we reach Marx, it's a settled fact that these philosophers believe that Christianity is a sidelined or a sideshow, really, even in this history, and belongs more in the realm of the private, or certainly of the marginalized. And Marx takes it even further to say that.
I would say that it was a creation of the capitalists to make people happy with the opiate.
A key part of continuing the subjugation of people. Yeah, exactly right. For the same reason that we've said before here, that it encourages them to think about the things that are spiritual, while keeping them from becoming aware that they are perpetually poor by design, and the proletariat always will be.
I just think of something. I remember when I was younger, hearing the argument of sort of, well, I guess in the defense of, I think some of the sort of Central American, what the Sandinistas, maybe who cares about freedoms if you don't have enough to eat? But at the same time, there was the news about these Cambodian refugees, and here they are in this refugee camp, and they pooled together money and all kinds of things so they could have the court dancers come back. So here, which involves gold and silk and special. These people put aside for special training, even in such a grim place as a refugee camp. So it said, okay, the emotional things and maybe the nationalist things are really, really important.
One of the things that Marx says, which I think is actually really interesting, and this gets lifted up by I think Foucault says this too, is the point of the machinery of modern capitalism, but I think that this holds true for Marxism in principle too, is to actually turn people into machines. Is that you, again, this is the subject-object thing, right?
Yeah.
Little by little, the way that you spend your time at work, at home, becomes mechanical. You basically do this. It doesn't leave room for us to enjoy the higher things of the spirit, the art, the culture, the things that were in a pre-industrial revolution time critical to the functioning. In many ways now we even look back on, that's a modern example, that's a great one from the modern context, but we look back on some of the frivolities of the church, for instance, in the Middle Ages, right? I mean, in the Lutheran Church, we're kind of one of the heralds of modernism, in that Luther pointed out that excess of the church and said that was wrong, and that people ultimately should be given this agency to choose for themselves. They should not be under the control of the system that where opulence rules in the churches, where you can see the paintings still today in the churches. They're huge, and it strikes us as like, that's a terrible usage of time and resources. But what's our alternative? What have we said is better since then? How have we lifted up the spirit in the modern era in any more meaningful of ways, or have we just changed the methods by which we subjugate people differently? And give them credit. I mean, those churches remain beautiful. They are a lingering testament to how special that is. And those dances, I bet, were uplifting for the spirit of the Cambodian people who had.
Oh, sure, that's why they did it. I mean,
does that make them meaningful? Maybe it does. But it's again, this is Fukuyama saying it's impossible for us even to imagine a world that doesn't center around the exchange of goods and services in a very capitalist linear way.
Yeah, but I guess I think that, I don't think Marxism got that far beyond the theoretical in that whole thinking about how people should organize societies economically. I mean, Marx had at a very detailed thought experiment that in reality didn't work out very well in the Soviet Union, and it hasn't been very successful in China or anywhere else, really. So, but what we call the capitalist system has in effect been used to some degree or another from time immemorial. Because I do what I can do, I plant or I create something and I sell it maybe, or use it to eat, and that works for me. If I make more than I need to eat, then I can make a little something else and buy a horse, whatever. And I guess what I'm saying is Marxism, I think, is a sideshow. It never should have been thought of as a serious idea that was conflicted with, but it's never a successful competitor with capitalism.
Thank you for putting into words, I think, what that's a pretty commonly held, I would say, belief, but it nevertheless trying to give due to the thought of Marxism and to people who retain that. And
I mean, Marxism says nobody should own the means of production. That it should be owned in common, and the state will melt away because you don't need the state. And that's just antithetical to human behavior, as people have found out forever.
Sure.
So that's why I don't think it was ever a viable concept.
Yeah. Well, and again, like I say, the postmodernists agree with you. Not necessarily, I would say, on the critique thereof, but really that the meta narrative around Marxism as an inevitability, as a conclusion of the arc of history, bit off more than it could chew.
Well, Marx was observing industrialism in the first half of the 19th century, and it was bad for a lot of people.
Yep.
Inequality was hardly even the word to describe it.
Right.
So he saw a lot of oppression, and the only way to get rid of the oppression, he thought, was to get rid of the industrial system, or ownership of the industrial system.
Right. Yeah, I think the thing is, though, that Marx's ideas didn't just stop with Marx, right? There have been people who keep the banner alive, and for whom, there's everyone from moderates in Europe who do implement socialist ideas to fairly decent effect, actually, within their own system, but who maybe don't believe the extent that Marx says about, like, we need to really restructure all society. We just believe that it's okay for the state to actually have ownership of some, and frankly, we forget that here in this country we do the same thing. I mean, we do have a lot of things held nationally.
Sure.
And that's the means of production.
It's a kind of a silly distinction even between socialism and capitalism, because we have a modified capitalism in the
Correct.
United States that doesn't go as far as Sweden or Norway may toward ownership or control of capitalism, but it's a spectrum, not really a totally different system.
Yeah, correct. It is a spectrum, right? What I think is useful about the postmodern critique of both of them, though, is to say that for as much as now we can see through the beliefs and all the different little pieces that have to be held in order for the absurdity of Marxism to stay alive, that is equally as true about capitalism, just that we're in it. And I would challenge the assertion that time immemorial has been a capitalist time immemorial, that the exchange of goods and services has always looked this way. That, to people like Foucault, is part of the narrative that capitalism has sold us, that we have always been a society that looks like that. And actually, they have a lot of strong evidence from sociologists too, and from archaeologists who say that, the fundamental early modern human way of being with one another was both nobler and less noble, in the sense that we are more wired to be to hold things in common and to develop societies around shared use, but at the same time too, it it's not a free market liberal exchange of things. It oftentimes was a singular control of the powerful over the less powerful.
Yeah, see, I would say that a feudal system, while it doesn't look capitalist, it is in a way, because if I'm a lord, I in theory own all the land around my castle, and I have people who live on it who are serfs, and I give them protection, they give me part of what they produce. So it's they don't get money for what they...
So if I'll jump in there, Foucault would say the story they will tell is that they give them protection. The reality is that there is an exchange of power that's happening there, and...
Okay. But, I mean, obviously the serf can't protect himself from the invading neighbors. Maybe the lord will, or maybe he won't, but that's the only chance the serf has. In the capitalist system, I might buy something that looks like a Volvo, but it may be a Ford underneath, and I don't know that, so is that not capitalism? It is.
Yeah.
Faulty.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea of under what reasoning will the lord appeal to the serf that he's lording over him, and perhaps it'll be just naked force. Perhaps he'll just say, "I'll just kill you. I'll kill you if you don't give me." But perhaps he'll say, "No, there's a reason for this. I'm here to protect you. It's better this way." Perhaps he'll appeal to some divine thing. I'm saying, "I've actually been sent by God to lord over you. This is the rights as they are divinely set forth." Perhaps he'll appeal to some sort of universal concept of right and wrong and just and not just. Foucault says the only thing that really matters is the power. It's the power between the two, and he'll come up with any reason. There's 1,000 to choose from, and they've all been chosen differently, and that, he says, hasn't changed. I mean, I guess you're right in the sense that there's nothing new in what Marxists would call late capitalism, where we are now, that fundamentally distinguishes itself from that, or is unable to be analyzed from the perspective of power. We are still playing around with power, exchanging power back and forth, Do
these people like Foucault think that the people who on whom power is exercised willingly give that exercise to the strong person, or does the strong person just seize it and the weak person has no ability to take it back?
I don't want to mischaracterize, so I don't know. Say that again.
I always do a little thought experiment about early society, and I think to myself that if there were only one person in the world, there would be no laws, there would be no cooperation, no sharing, no buying or anything. But once you have just a small family of cavemen, then the woman would be tasked with making the fire, and the husband would be tasked with going out to hunt something, and they share. She cooks and he brings the food back. So there's a sharing based on a perception that one can do one thing better than the other person can do. Mm-hmm. And the same kind of decision that one tribe in one locality is better at herding cows and the people in the other locality are better at finding berries means that eventually they'll see that they can do better between themselves by one specializing and then trading. But that's a decision they make because it's advantageous to them.
Yeah.
You can get out of that system because the hunters can say, we're just going to take your berries because we've got the bows and arrows and you don't have anything.
Right.
And that will happen for a while, but I think eventually that evens itself out because the people, the hunters or the berry gatherers will say, we're going to go somewhere else because these guys aren't being fair to us.
Yeah.
And so there is over time, a sort of Hegelian dialectic going back and forth about how these organizations relate to each other.
Yep. So that's one view of how that goes down, right?
Yeah, that's mine.
You can characterize a thought experiment differently too, right? Of saying, so all those different people got together, but then we have to introduce scarcity into it. There was no place else for one of the groups to go. And so what happens in that? or maybe the hunters said, I do like the way the system's set up right now, but we want a larger share of what you make. And the reason why we get it isn't because we're going to be providing with more meat, but simply because we can take it. And doesn't that become pretty attractive pretty fast to the hunters?
To the hunters, yeah, not to the berry guy.
But what are they able to do about it?
Go away.
Yeah.
Go somewhere else.
What if
Yeah,
they
give
can't?
them poison berries. Yeah.
What if they can't go somewhere else?
Well, then if they can't, they can't. But
Yeah.
if they have the opportunity, they'll do something else. That's okay. If I had an opportunity to work somewhere other than McDonald's for $6.50 an hour, and I can go work for $12 an hour, I'm going to do that.
Well, that's one of the essences, I think, of this, of the critique about this, is that there is nowhere else for a person to be other than in a capitalist
Well, that's true.
liberal democracy right now. That's it. The alternative is actually you could go to some pre-modern parts of the world, but we have all sort of said, no, thank you.
But,
Right.
And my point is only that I don't think Marxism was ever an alternative to the capitalist system. It just didn't work. It wouldn't work.
Fukuyama was the person who fundamentally agrees with you on that too. And the few people who are left who are true Marxists who are still waving that banner and saying, no, the Soviet Union wasn't a proper example of it. No, China wasn't a proper example of it. No, East Germany wasn't a proper example of it. East Germany was really supposed to be the crown jewel in the rise of global Marxism, because it was the place where Marx thought that it actually may have worked. And the fact that it wasn't working in agrarian Russia or in pre-modern feeling China was just, it was an excuse for why that wasn't supposed to happen. But Germany was supposed to be where an industrialized nation, the proletariat, fundamentally realized what they had and overthrew the bourgeois and really seized the means of production and created a workers' paradise. But instead it became a police state that was...
Yeah, I think people could argue that that's because of the domination of
the
Russia.
Soviet Union, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps. And listen, I know a lot of East Germans who have this weird complex where they still think back on those years with some nostalgia in this bizarre sort of way. But I know plenty of other East Germans who,
I think you could argue that Russia was, its experiment in Marxism was really, its failure was rooted in World War I, and the fact that because the Bolsheviks pulled out of the war against Germany, and the U.S. and the Allies then moved against the Bolsheviks, that forced Lenin and Trotsky and then eventually Stalin to do things they might not have had to do otherwise in order to defend themselves.
yeah, perhaps.
You can make all those kinds of arguments.
Nevertheless, they saw their worldview as being part of a global war,
Yes.
right? A global conflict against the capitalist forces. That may have been the case anyway all the time. I mean, Marx would have argued that this is definitely going to result in conflict. There's no way the people who are now in charge are going to willingly give that up. But what's interesting is that the ballot box in places like the Nordic countries has actually been enough to get at least some incremental changes towards things which are seemingly obviously better held by the people to happen that way, including things like healthcare, right?
Right, which brings us to Bernie and Elizabeth. But I mean, the problem that
Now, their problem is they're going to have to translate what has been a many decades long system of private thing here into something that's ever possibly going to work in America in that sense, and that's going to be tough.
To me, what Russia revealed was that, and China, that the political state isn't a better controller or a fair distributor of wealth or benefits than corporate America or the capitalist system.
Yeah.
In fact, it's subject to even more wrong use.
Yeah, but is it still a tool? So here's the question, that the hermeneutical turn that I want to make now is, as we talk about Christianity in this realm, if we have seen postmodernism destroy meta-narratives like the Marxist one and completely shatter that for what it's worth, and look at capitalism and say that the underpinnings are not as secure as they say either, or just really any of the things that came out of the High Enlightenment, if those things all have more to do about the stories that we were told, the things that we have been conditioned to believe, or just a series of unspoken social contracts and constructs, if that's the case, what are we as Christians left with? Is sort of in this realm of what I would say is almost rebirth, and that is, I think, my hopeful message at the end of all this, is that everything's up for grabs, and nothing is unassailably sacred anymore. So we are free to make our truth claims again in a new system with, I think, some sort of renewed authenticity or renewed appeal. And everything is up for use. So I would say if the Christian is looking to look at society and reorder it, or to encourage its reordering in a certain way, are Marxist tools on the table? Probably. Are capitalist tools on the table? Definitely. I mean, we're still under the large-scale dominion of that. Do you have to take everything that comes along with that package as a meta-narrative anymore? No, you don't, because it's shattered. To say that it would be better that we all worked together for this common end doesn't mean that you have to fundamentally believe that the proletariat is also going to rise up one day and eat the rich. That can be divorced now from that conversation. Doesn't mean also that if there are things that deserve to be freed, so that the goods and services can be distributed among the people and not held solely by the powers, whether they be the state powers or by any other person, that also can be the case. And you can appeal to Adam Smith and say, but do you have to say at the end of the day that the only good is that this wealth determines your worth? No, you don't have to say that anymore. But you can say that the thing in itself actually is useful for human flourishing. I think Christianity is useful in this because it's got a longer track record than any of those other meta-narratives ever had, and spent a lot more time thinking about how the things of the spirit and the things of the flesh, the things of value and the things of material, how they can blend together and come up with a system.
See, I'm not going to be able to say this very right, but that's, it seems like in the modern times, capitalism is dominating or is using Christianity to its own means, and that a lot of people feel like with control, the Christian church is also extremely controlling, and it's a
good point.
It's man-made. There are people who believe that it's all man-made or humankind made to control people, and we're using it's all about capitalism, and we're using Christianity to further those means.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the Marxist critique, right? I mean, right there is that very connected. I remember NPR had an interview a while back where they interviewed a Chinese socialist thinker who was studying here in the States. And he was a Marxist thinker. And remember the guy on NPR joked, he goes, I didn't know there were any left of those, because, almost all the intellectuals in China are now basically pushing for pro-democracy reforms and for economic freedom. But here was this guy, and what he was studying was capitalism. And he said, I was actually shocked. I never saw it before now, but I was shocked how Christianity really is one of the pillars that props up capitalism in the world, that faith is critical to the functioning of capital in that way. And I think that there would be ample things to point at for that to be true. And has Christianity been a willing partner?
A lot of people would say yes. It's hand in glove or whatever.
Do you see a different system in Muslim countries?
That's a really interesting question.
I don't think so. I think basically it's the same. And I think what that, and in addition, I think there existed capitalism well before there existed Christianity, that is before 2000, 0 AD, because there was this system of barter and trade, and the Phoenicians were trading with the Greeks and all that.
And accumulation of wealth, so
yes.
particularly in Rome.
And I think religion was a part of all those civilizations, and religion, no doubt, was complementary in some way to trade and capitalism. So yeah, it is complementary. I wouldn't say that capitalism created Christianity or is the sole support for Christianity.
This made me think of Dostoevsky actually blamed the Catholic Church for socialism, which was because he really didn't like the Catholic Church at all, and which is. I thought it was sort of strange, but I thought he's also somebody who thought about things.
So it's really
Oh no, he's
Orthodox for sure.
using
Yeah.
Christianity for their own means, right? Is that really what we're saying?
Well, he didn't. He only blamed Catholicism.
Yeah.
He didn't blame he was towards the end, he was very reactionary and very firm believer in the Orthodox Church, but he didn't, he wrote he wrote essentially at one point, essentially blaming the Catholic Church for the crucifixion by having Jesus come back again, show up in the Vatican, and having some cardinal say, yeah, we'd kill you too,
That was a little hard to follow.
Yeah, well, but it's actually not without its antecedents, though, too. I mean, for a long time, Judaism was blamed for the creation of socialism, too.
Existed before Christ did. The Catholic Church didn't. So.
Yeah, but that's
But the blame it for socialism.
Yeah.
But, I mean...
Interesting things.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. The ultimate critique, though, I think, when you talk about capitalism having existed before all that, the point that the postmodernists are making about capitalism not existing anymore as a meta-narrative isn't to say that there was never barter or trade. It was to say that the way that we conceptualize of and have written a story about capitalism is a modern invention. So while that was happening back then, they weren't saying to themselves, I'm doing capitalism right now.
No, of course not.
Right. It's only later when we apply our lens to the understanding of what was happening do we say this is the way it is. And that's important because that also helps us to then think about the way that it will be or the way that it is now. And a critical examination of that also takes into account how we arrived at those conclusions is what's liberative. Because it doesn't mean that those narratives control us anymore or that they must be that way. It means that we're free from them. And that is unfortunately where the Christian church has come in a bad way in the past too. The same way that they propped up the divine right of kings and said, this is the way things are because it must be, and gave legitimacy to that claim. That's what that Chinese guy was saying too, was that essentially a form of Christianity that really took heavy root in America around materialism and around the value of hard work, right? In the Protestant work ethic, this Calvinist notion, that became part and parcel with the meta-narrative, and so we were pulled in along with it. Our faith tradition wasn't that one. We weren't present for that, so we've got a little bit of a different take. And over the span of Christianity, that's more of a blip on the radar than anything else. But it's a blip that became an explosion because America happened to skyrocket to the most important place in the world following the destruction of every major economy in the world except for ours in the post-war years. So we kind of set the tone for how we talk about economies, stuff, everything, and we have imported this Calvinist notion right along inside with us. Is that too much baggage for us to deal with? I hope not. I hope that there is a way that that the broader and truer idea of what God brings to the world, which is abundance, which is plenty, and it sometimes happens through sharing, and it sometimes happens through our labors, but is always connected to spirit and value and worth and goodness. That I hope has a new life or a new blooming that can happen in this era. And I think it has to, because we are seeing all the time people who are waking up to the postmodern world. And I'm being cautious to stay away from the constructive elements of postmodernism, because there are a lot of people who say, so now what? This is useful as a critique of what's alive in the world and what's dying in the world. What you going to do about it? What does that lead you to? I'm careful of staying away from those things because they become contentious, and some people say, oh, I don't know if I agree with that or not. But it's just useful to say that we are at a new beginning. And that's kind of my thesis statement from the beginning. To come back around again, the continental philosophers have arrived at some of the conclusions that Christianity arrived at a long time ago, and have given us the opportunity to state and make our case again. And I hope that we do make it. Any final comments?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. That was almost exactly an hour. Great. So this has been in depth, and is a chance again for us to engage with topics of cultural relevance. Here in this season of materialism, we began with the great material philosophies and a examination of how they fit into the larger Christian worldview. Next time we will be here is December 8th, and that is what we're doing in Advent. All Creatures Sunday, all God's creatures. Not exactly blessing the animals, but something akin to it. And what we'll do on that Sunday is talk a little bit about, just like what it sounds, the idea of the natural world, all creation, how Christianity looks at that, particularly in an era, in an age where in a critical and an increasingly critical thing that we look at is our natural environment and our relationship to it and catastrophe with it. There's a whole new term called eco-anxiety of people in the Western world who are terrified to death that their world is crumbling around them as a result of things like climate change. So we will delve into that as a topic. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.